The challenges we face today are truly overwhelming. Yet, we are not the first people to have to overcome our fears. Our sermon series, Profiles in Courage, will look at scriptural heroes to inspire, embolden, and encourage us to keep the faith in the face of fear.
So for today's Profile in Courage, we're going to take another look at St. Paul. You may recall just a few weeks back we looked at someone named Barnabas, who was known as the son of encouragement, and how Barnabas had the courage to encourage Paul at a time when no one else believed in him or trusted him. And Barnabas, we saw, he validated Christ's claim on Paul's life. And because of that, Paul became fortified with Christ. He became filled with courage and confident of his place within the broader mission of God in the world. Today, we're going to jump toward the end of the book of Acts, to Acts chapter 27, to a time when Paul finds himself as a prisoner on a ship set for Rome. Paul had been imprisoned for proclaiming Christ, and now he's being sent to Rome to testify before the courts there. We hear in Acts 27 that Paul is this prisoner among many prisoners on this ship set for Rome, and how their journey, their voyage across the sea becomes very treacherous very quickly. Let's hear a few of those verses 18 to 20. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Now, this is what we might call being lost in a sea of despair. All hope of their lives being saved had been abandoned. It had been lost in the chaos of the raging storm that enveloped them. But there was one soul on that ship that had not yet succumbed to the despair. That was Paul. Paul was fortified with Christ, filled with courage. And his presence on that ship, it would become a source of calm in the midst of the chaos of that moment. Paul's courage would become a lifeline for others on the ship, both the prisoners and the soldiers who were responsible for the prisoners and the sailors on the ship. In the same way that Barnabas' encouragement encouraged Paul, Paul's courage had a way of inspiring courage in the lives of his shipmates. We might say that Paul possessed a sort of contagious courage. Now, we live in a very contagious time, don't we? I'm well aware that speaking of Paul's courage in the language of as it being contagious, it might be a bit triggering for us today. We find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic moment where we're thinking about contagions all the time. COVID-19 has permeated, it seems, every aspect of our lives. But infectious diseases like COVID-19, they're not the only contagions whose spread have a way of impacting our lives. For example, psychologists suggest that what they call social contagions are just as real and just as impactful on our lives. Like infectious diseases, they get transmitted between persons. Our feelings and our behaviors, psychologists say, can be deeply influenced by the feelings and the behaviors of others. That's what they call social contagion. In other words, social contagion, it can be just as contagious. We might think, for example, of the common saying that laughter is contagious. Television creators, for one, they have understood this for a long time. That's why they created things like laugh tracks in beloved sitcoms. Laughing just comes more naturally around the laughter of others. Maybe you've found yourself in a situation before with a friend where you begin to laugh in kind of the wrong context. Maybe it was a classroom or a wedding or a church service. And the more the other person snickers, the more you begin to snicker, and it goes back and forth until before you know it, you kind of risk causing a scene with your misplaced laughter. Laughter certainly is contagious, but maybe more contagious than laughter are social contagions of a more negative sense. Social contagions like fear and anxiety and panic. At the outset of the pandemic that we find ourselves in right now, we saw the impact of these more negative social contagions quite clearly when none of us could find toilet paper anywhere. Folks had heard that everyone was out buying toilet paper and supplies were running low, and so everyone jumped in on that anxious search for that precious item. Fear, anxiety, and panic, these are very powerful, sometimes even dangerous social contagions. We might think about maybe footage from the Black Friday sales after Thanksgiving, where people turned to trampling over one another and breaking down doors just in an effort to get their hands on that discounted TV or that Barbie doll. In your right mind, on any other day, you wouldn't dare act like that. But when you find yourself in the midst of an unruly crowd, your typically guarded self, it gives way to a stampeding self. Social contagions, they're real, and they can have very real impacts on our lives. I can remember a time when Andy and I were living abroad, and the social contagion of fear and panic, it became very real to us. This was prior to moving to North Carolina to attend Duke Divinity School. When Andy and I, we were living in South Korea. We were teaching English there for a year. And about once a month, we would hop on a train and go to the nearest Costco wholesale just to buy some food items that would remind us of home. One grocery shopping trip, we were suddenly overcome by a feeling of confusion and panic when an extremely loud alarm, a siren, began just going off in the building. We looked around to see what was going on, and the shoppers around us, they also began seeming like they were in a panic as well. And they were grabbing their loved ones, they were leaving their shopping carts and hurrying up to the exit at the front of the store. But since we didn't speak Korean, we didn't understand what anyone around us was saying. All we had to go on was their behaviors. We didn't know, was it a fire? Was it a gas leak? Was it a bomb threat? We had no idea. And so seeing the behavior of everyone around us, Andy and I, we followed suit. We left our cart and we began making our way hurriedly to the exit. But then something interesting happened. A voice came over the loudspeaker, and suddenly everyone's frantic rush to the exit stopped. It just came to an abrupt halt, and almost as quickly as it began, the people around us returned to shopping as if nothing had happened. Again, not understanding Korean, we didn't know what they were saying over the speaker, so we could only assume that everything was okay based on the behaviors of those around us. It must have been some kind of false alarm. You see, social contagions, they are real, and they can have very real impacts, sometimes drastic effects on our lives. And arguably, no social contagion can be as contagious as something like fear and anxiety and panic. But there's a question that our scripture story today in Acts 27 poses for us, and that's whether courage can be as contagious as fear, anxiety, and panic. See, on that ship, overwhelmed by the treacherous sea, prisoners and the soldiers and the sailors, they all retreated to cowardice. Meanwhile, Paul, he had a way somehow of standing firm with courage. Let's hear from the text again, verses 22 to 26. It says, I urge you now, this is Paul speaking, I urge you now to keep your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong, and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God, that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we will have to run aground on some island. Now, what was the source of Paul's courage? When everyone else was turning to cowardice, where did Paul's courage come from? Well, what we hear in this text is that Paul's courage, it found a root in the broader mission of God. An angel of God comes to Paul in a dream and reminds Paul that his life is wrapped up in the broader mission of God. This helped Paul to take a step back and to understand his life and the turmoil around him in the bigger picture of what God was doing in the world. And this clarity of vision that he gets from stepping back, this protected Paul from despair, from cowardice, and instead it filled him with courage. Now, 14 days passed and the treacherous conditions continued, but Paul remained steadfast. He remained fortified with Christ and filled with courage. Let's hear from verses 33 to 38. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive. For none of you will lose a hair from your heads." After he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. Now that social contagion of panic and fear had spread among all those on the ship. They were paralyzed by the panic. They were frozen with fear, and they had all lost hope. And when hope is lost, the simplest of things can suddenly feel like a mountain impossible to climb. Their despair had made something as simple and basic as eating seem like a pointless act. But Paul, fortified with Christ, filled with courage, he had the wherewithal to recognize everyone's need for physical nourishment. Paul understood his place within the broader mission of God. Paul knew that he needed to bear witness to Christ in Rome, and God was going to make sure that he got there. Paul was going to make sure that they were going to make it, all of them. But he knew also that they would have to do their part. They would need physical nourishment to face the challenges ahead. And so Paul did something quite profound, but it was something simple, something as basic as breathing. He simply ate. He ate some bread. It's a most mundane act, but in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the despair, it was a holy act. It was a sacred, sacramental act. It was an act tinged with defiant hope. And the others on the ship, as they witnessed Paul partake in this simple but necessary act of eating bread, they found within themselves a renewed courage to eat. And that physical sustenance in the midst of a spiritually and emotionally starved moment, it provided them with the spiritual and the emotional nourishment that they needed to keep going, to hope for another day. Paul's courage, again, we might say, was contagious here. And that contagious courage, it gave Paul's shipmates the courage they needed to eventually make it to land, albeit by a shipwreck. Every last one of them, we hear at the end of chapter 27, makes it to the land. The prisoners, the soldiers, the sailors alike, they all make it safely. And every last one of them, they drew the ounce of courage that they needed to make it from Paul, from his contagious courage. Now, certainly fear, anxiety, and panic, they can be very pervasive, very powerful, sometimes dangerous social contagions. But it seems that, as in the case of St. Paul, maybe courage can be quite contagious too. There's a psychologist named Susan David, and she studied this phenomenon of social contagion. And she suggests a very practical exercise whenever you find yourself particularly susceptible to social contagions like fear, anxiety, and panic. This is what she says about finding yourself in a moment like that. She says, "We are more than our fear. We are also our intentions, our wisdom, our compassion. And these are all honed and driven and become capable through our sense of what our values are. So this is what she suggests as an exercise to help us regain some clarity of our values. She said, in a moment of fear, anxiety, and panic, sit down for a couple minutes with a pen and a piece of paper before you and ask yourself this question. Even in the midst of this chaos, who do I want to be? Even in the midst of this chaos, who do I want to be? And she suggests that you take a few minutes to write an answer to that question. And I wonder if that's what Paul's meal on that ship, in the midst of that chaos, in the midst of the despair, if that's what the meal was doing. And I wonder if that's what the church at its best can do for us, can do for the world in the chaotic time in which we live. Paul was fortified with Christ, was filled with courage and confident of his place in God's broader mission. And this courage, it gave him the ability to invite others to do this simple yet holy act of eating. And this was an act of faith, an act of hope in the midst of the chaos around them. It was maybe a bit like sitting down with a pen and a piece of paper and asking that question. In the midst of this chaos, who do I want to be? So I believe it is also with the church. Our weekly worship, our habit, our rhythm of gathering together weekly, even if virtually, around things like the Holy Scriptures, around prayer, around spiritual songs and testimony and bread and juice, this rhythm of gathering together for worship, it serves as a weekly sit-down, if you will. A sit-down in the midst of the chaos of our moment, the chaos of our world. Like that psychologist Susan David suggests, of sitting down with pen and paper to regain clarity on who we want to be. Christ invites us through the church to do just that, to regain clarity of God's broader mission in the world. So friends, this is my prayer for each one of you this week, that in this chaotic time, you might be fortified with Christ. You might be filled with courage, and that you may be found confident of your place within the broader mission of God in the world. Amen.